Welcome to the Brain Health Podcast, where we discuss cutting-edge science to help you maximize your brain function while aiming to slow, stop, and even reverse symptoms of cognitive decline. I'm your host, Dr. Jonah Yackel. Hi, thanks for tuning in. Today, we are going to deviate just a little bit from our typical conversations on how we can support optimal brain health, although this is very much up that alley. But today I'm going to be talking about the top mistakes that are made when people are trying to recover from chronic inflammatory response syndrome and mold-related illness. Now, one, I think it's important just to remember that I've been there, that my entire health journey and what I'm doing today is predicated by the fact that I got incredibly sick, and I got sick from a combination of factors, but it culminated in chronic inflammatory response syndrome and mold-related illness. And then I've been through this recovery. This is something that I did myself. Well, I didn't do it on my own by myself. I actually had an incredible mentor. I worked with Richie Shoemaker, who saved my brain. He saved my life. And I've since then become certified in his protocols and his work. And I work with clients all day, every day who are struggling with chronic inflammatory response syndrome and are struggling to heal and struggling to recover. And so I've seen the ups and downs. I've seen the ins and outs, and I've seen what works and I've seen what doesn't work, both personally and professionally. And I think that this is a major difference when it comes to picking out practitioners that you're working with. And this conversation was really stimulated by a recent conversation that I had with a potential client who'd been working with a functional health practitioner who was not so much familiar with Richie Shoemaker and the work that he was doing, and was not familiar with the gold standard and the science-based or the evidence-based approaches. And as I spoke with this person, it became evident that almost all of the information they were given was actually the exact opposite of what I recommend. And, this is a huge challenge. I get so many clients showing up in my practice who have been through one protocol or another in association with mold, and they didn't get better. And I think it just is really important that we have this conversation and discuss some of the top reasons why a CIRS protocol, one, is so intensive and why it doesn't necessarily always work. So let's have that conversation today. So number one, let's just right out of the gate. The number one most common reason people do not get better and recover from mold-related illness and chronic inflammatory response syndrome is they do not get out of exposure. They either assume that they are in a clean space, or they don't want to know if their space is potentially contaminated, or they don't know how to test properly. Or maybe they haven't been told that it's important. There can be a lot of reasons. And unfortunately, some of these reasons are just painful realities. I've worked with clients who just simply can't afford to get out of a moldy space. And these are really challenging situations to be in. But bottom line, the number one reason people don't get better from chronic inflammatory response syndrome is because they don't get out of mold. And in this case, when I was talking to this potential client, it turned out they weren't even informed on how to properly test for mold. So let's have that conversation right now. The gold standard for testing for potential exposure is by a company called Envirobiomics. And you can, at a minimum, you can buy what's called an ERMI, E-R-M-I. It's a at-home Swiffer kit. Do not get the vacuum pack. Get the Swiffer kit. You'll go around your house. You're going to collect dust from several different areas. You want to get it from all the rooms, including kitchens and bathrooms. Don't get it wet. Don't get the Swiffer dirty. Don't get it greasy, but just swiff up dust. Make sure you're getting stuff at all different levels, knee, waist, shoulders, above the head, because different molds have different weights. So it's like you want to get a good sampling of the house. But there are pros and cons to this test. So there's no perfect test. that can be done. But here's what we know is that your typical remediator or inspector, they use what's called air spore trap test. So they'll come in, they'll just run air through this trap, they'll collect spores. Now, the problem with this is that one, it only collects spores. That's not the only thing that can make people sick. These spores can be broken down, they can be fragmented. There's toxins, so there's all kind of dead mold. Fragments of dead mold can make people just as inflamed as an actual live mold spore. So these air trap tests pick up about 2% of the particulates in the air that could potentially be making somebody sick. So truthfully, it's like if someone does one of those tests and it comes back positive, you've got a big problem. But if you do it and it's negative, that doesn't really mean anything, especially for someone who's sick with chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And ERMI, on the other hand, it comes with what's called a Hurts Me 2 score. And that's HERTSMI-2, a Hurts Me 2 score. Now, the Hurts Me 2 score is actually a predictor. This number can predict whether or not an environment is clean enough for someone to heal in. So that, hands down, is worth the money. We have to know that number. Is the environment clean enough specifically for the protocol to work? One case that I find a lot is that people, maybe they were living in a moldy home, that's where they got sick, and they moved out and they moved into a new space. And, because it was a newer space and it seemed clean, they didn't bother to test the new space. But we have to test. We cannot assume we're in a clean space. We always have to know what the status is, and we need to know that Hurts Me 2 score in order for us to know, what is the prediction? What is the likelihood? It is a statistically relevant number that can predict someone's recovery on the protocol. So we never assume. We can never make the assumption that someone is not being exposed, regardless of how new it is. I've had clients come to me with all kinds of new buildings. I mean, I've seen buildings go up that had black mold growing on the drywall before it was even hung up. I've had cases where a client had a home specifically built to be mold free. So they brought out all the stops only to find out that the plumbing was put in wrong and there was a leak behind their kitchen in the wall before they actually ever even moved in. I've heard of work buildings. I've actually seen this where brand new multi-million-dollar buildings were built, and then within the first week, huge rainstorm hits and there's water coming through the ceiling. So a brand new build, do not assume it's clean because it's new. Yes, your percentages go up, that it's less likely to be water damaged, but we have to face it. An estimated 60 to 80% of all homes and buildings have been water damaged. 60 to 80%. And I personally would say that's probably an underestimate when you consider that. I mean, show me the home that has not ever had a water leak. It's never had a leaky faucet. It's never had a leaky condensation from the HVAC, or even humidity above 60% is enough to cause a water intrusion event. So, I mean, show me the home that's never been water damaged. They practically don't exist. I mean, it's just a matter of time. So we always have to test. We never assume. Another one that I get a lot from clients is, well, I can feel it. It feels clean. It smells clean. I know, I'm highly sensitive. I know when I'm being exposed. And I believe that to be true. I do think that a lot of people know when they're being exposed, and that we can actually become our own sensor. But that doesn't replace testing either. We use both of those tools at that point. Yes, use your intuition, use your gut, but you also have to test. We have brains at stake here, not to mention recovery protocols that are rarely covered, if ever, by insurance. So, I mean, these protocols are expensive. The recovery from chronic inflammatory response syndrome, anyone who's done it, we know how expensive it is. Between moving, between remediation, between getting rid of stuff, between getting new stuff, between all of the different, things required for the recovery protocol, like the peptides needed to heal the brain, it's costly. And when we make mistakes, it can set us back months or more and it can be devastating financially. So, and we also know that the protocols for healing from chronic inflammatory response syndrome, they only work if exposure levels are below a certain threshold. So again, and I've learned this from experience, but if you go through a protocol and you have not validated that your exposure levels are below a certain threshold, there's a good chance you might spend the next 6 to 12 months or longer. I've had people show up in my office who've been treated for over a decade and never got better because their home was never tested. It was always just assumed that it was clean. So we have to test. Number one mistake, the reason why people don't get better. And I think that a lot of doctors who haven't actually been through this, who haven't had to recover from chronic inflammatory response syndrome, they tend to minimize the importance of this. It cannot be minimized. Like 20 to 30% of the population has increased sensitivity to mold, which means that the general acceptable limits are not going to work for those folks. So again, I think doctors, it's like they don't get involved in remediation. Oftentimes they don't get involved in the cleanup. They just tell people get out of mold, but they don't know any better. They don't know any more beyond that. And so again, people just do the best they can and they end up stuck in mold. So the number one reason people don't get better is they just don't get out of mold. They don't do the proper testing. So at a minimum, you've got to do an ERMI. Now, what we're learning also is that mold is not the only root cause of chronic inflammatory response syndrome, but for some people, it can be exposure to bacteria and endotoxins as well. So the gold standard testing, the number one test, if finances is a non-factor, if we can invest in doing proper testing, you can go to envirobiomics.com. You'd get kit number 8. This includes an ERMI, which will come with the Hertz Me score, but it also has endotoxins and actinomycetes testing as well. So the bacterias as well. So at a minimum, you want to do a kit number 1, which is an ERMI. Best case scenario, you want to do a kit number 8. Which is an ERMI and endotoxins and actinomycetes. And when I'm working with clients and we're doing one-on-one work, I'll walk them through the process and how to actually do the collection properly so that we can get the best potential results, because it's a little bit nuanced as well. But so that's number one, getting out of exposure. And I mean, that's a forgotten step. That is the first step in any protocol. It's not detoxing, it's not shutting off inflammation. Like, all of those are dependent. All the other steps. So a proper protocol in mold recovery includes multiple steps. So step number 1 is removal from exposure. Step number 2 is detoxification. Step number 3 is turning off the inflammation that resulted from the ongoing exposure. Step number 4 is healing the tissues that were damaged. And again, we skip that first step, none of the other stuff is going to work. If you try to heal damaged tissues before you shut off the inflammation, protocol is not going to work. Like, it has to be done in order. So skipping steps, taking shortcuts, trying to get to the end can be disastrous, because what ends up happening is either, one, people give up on the protocol and they're like, well, it must not have been mold because I did the protocol and it didn't work, when in fact, they never even got through the first step. They never actually got out of exposure. So of course the protocol didn't work. Or maybe people burn up all their money. They spend all their money trying to recover, and then they can't finish the protocol. Like, these are disastrous outcomes. Other reasons, other mistakes people make is they get advice from poor sources. They'll go onto forums and they're taking advice from people who are not getting better, people who have not recovered. Now, if the person is completely healed and recovered, that's one thing. But if we're getting our advice on how to go through these protocols from people who have not recovered, getting our advice from friends and family members and doctors who have no idea what chronic inflammatory response syndrome is, people don't get it. The potential client I was meeting with also had mentioned that their doctor said, don't go get educated. Don't go reading up on any of this stuff, because people tend to freak out and panic. And it's like, well, there is some truth to that. But the other truth is that you have to be your number one advocate. No one else understands this. Like, by the time you're through this recovery, you're going to get it better than most of your doctors. You're going to get it definitely more than your family members. Like, you have to become an expert in chronic inflammatory response syndrome and the recovery protocols. So, knowledge is power. Like, you have to be empowered. You have to seek out resources. I know Richie Shoemaker has written several great books on chronic inflammatory response syndrome. There's some great mold illness, recovering and surviving and thriving is an exceptional guidebook through this recovery. We've got our own Brain Plus program that is focused on providing community with sources of information that we can bank on. So it's important to work with people who are CIRS literate and only get your information from those sources. Otherwise, again, you might be costing yourselves a tremendous amount of time and a tremendous amount of money along the way. Going back again to the start, number one reason not getting out of exposure, major mistake I see people make is once they recognize that they're in exposure, they immediately get moved out in haste. They rush to get into a new place only to find that it's just as moldy or potentially even worse than where they were originally. So again, it's really important that we test appropriately and then we make, some well thought out discerning, like, we don't want to rush, spend all our money getting into a new place that's just as moldy, and now we're locked into a new lease, or maybe we just bought a new house. So, proper testing before we move into places is equally important. And there's a process that we provide to clients when they're trying to navigate how to move in to a clean space. So I think most important, number one, getting out of exposure, doing proper testings with envirobiomics, endotoxins, actinomycetes, looking to people who have healed and recovered, who are literate in chronic inflammatory response syndrome as sources of advice and inspiration, like getting educated. Like, you have to become your own advocate. No one is going to be able to advocate for you, and they're probably going to give you, family members give the worst advice to people who have chronic inflammatory response syndrome. They just don't get it. Even if they've got it themselves and they're in denial, they don't realize that they have it. The advice is horrible, and just don't take shortcuts. This is a marathon. It is not a sprint. People who take their time and do it right, they heal and recover. This protocol is incredibly effective. It works almost every time, provided people get out of exposure. People aren't out of exposure, well, then it works almost none of the time. So number one, heed that. Don't make that mistake. Don't assume that you're not being exposed. Don't assume because you're in a new home or because this isn't the space that made you sick. Don't assume because you already remediated. Remediators, oftentimes, they are not CIRS literate. They do not oftentimes hold their remediations to the standards of someone who is sick with chronic inflammatory response syndrome. They may say they get it, rarely do they actually get it. So don't make those assumptions.
Thanks for listening to the Brain Health Podcast. If you'd like more cutting-edge information on brain health, you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, or simply head over to my website, thebrainhealthdoctor.com. If you love the show and want to support us, please leave a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.